Hey folks, Darren with Fervent Astronomy. Today with the Sony 135mm f1.8 GM G Master for their E-mount cameras. This is a well-respected portrait lens, and we're going to see how it does for astrophotography. While not an old lens by any means, it's been out for long enough that one might wonder if there's a version 2 coming along. I think at the time that I'm recording this, there is a rumor of a version 2 of the Sigma 135 f1.8, although that's not so much a version 2, I guess, but more of a DG-DN version, a mirrorless specific version. And with Canon and Nikon with their Plena competitors coming out in the last couple of years, I'm really wondering if this lens might get revamped, but it is optically really well regarded, so maybe it doesn't need it. That said, it is a portrait lens. We're not going to be actually too concerned with any of that. So my hope is a nice flat field across the sky so that we can do some sort of wide field, deep sky stuff. Here we have a flicky aperture ring with, of course, the auto setting there. This one does not have a lock, so you can't actually lock the aperture ring like you can with some of the Sigma lenses. It is what it is. You can declick it though if you're going to be using this for dual duty video applications. And of course, we've got some custom buttons, one here on the top and one here on the side. AF, MF switch, as you would expect. And we actually have a focus limiter here, which, to be honest, we're not going to get much use out of. We do have, I would say, a fair to mid manual focus ring. It does feel like it could be a little bit more dampened, but it's not too bad. It does turn smoothly. Nice hood here. It's rubberized on the lip. Uses a button to remove it. Then below the 82mm lens cap here, we have our front element, which, as you might expect, is around 82mm in diameter. Got threaded for filters as well, so you don't have to mess around with nonsense. That being said, any kind of filter that you would use for astrophotography, I don't even know where you would find an 82mm filter to go in the front. But that being said, you can get various clip filters for various cameras, including Sony E-mount. So yeah, this is going to be interesting. I'm not quite sure what the results are because I haven't actually looked at them yet, but let's do that together now. All right, folks, welcome to Lightroom. We have got a lot to cover. Oh my gosh. So everything here is a tracked sample, tracked for a minimum of 60 seconds on the Fornax Mounts LighTrack II, sometimes 2 minutes, sometimes 3 minutes. The main samples are just 1 minute. Of course, Fervent Astronomy is Fornax's official distributor in North America. So if you have any questions about the LighTrack II or any interest in that, head on over to ferventastronomy.com to learn more. Everything here is taken with either the A7R Mark V or these two 8 and 9. These are the A7R Mark IV. My personal A7R Mark IV is Astro modified. So if we come over here and reset it, you'll see that things are quite red. So I've done a really quick kind of color balance on them just so it's somewhat useful. And we'll show you some of that stuff here in a little bit. Being that the A7R Mark V and Mark IV are sharing the same 60 megapixel sensor, they also happen to have the same dual gain sensor, and the second stage is at ISO 320 on both of them. These are what you would call ISO invariant cameras. What that means is anything above ISO 320, the camera is not using analog amplification. It uses digital amplification, which is the same as just coming up here and boosting the exposure in Lightroom. What does that mean? Well, for our purposes, it's no benefit, basically, to shooting at a higher ISO than 320 here, because assuming the exposure time and f-stop are the same, whether I shoot at 320 or 6400, I get the same noise level, I get the same ability to boost the shadows, but the higher the ISO I go, the more I lock myself into overexposed highlights potentially. So bright stars, bright nebula, cores of galaxies, you might clip those off the right side of the histogram and be unable to recover any detail there. And then you got to go through the hassle of shooting a bunch of underexposed frames, stacking all those in there as well, which you may still want to do. But in this case, if we shoot at ISO 320, we actually lock in the highlights with more information and potentially information that you could recover as compared to everything else being the same and shooting at a higher ISO. So that's the theory behind doing that. If you want to read a very good article explaining all of that in detail, there's a link in the description. It'll bring you back to ferventastronomy.com, where you will find a link to that article. You'll find some other resources, and you'll find a link to most of these samples. I think I'm going to keep this one back because I actually want to do something with it, but I will provide most of the rest of these for your use. And that use includes the personal perusal for the purpose of predicting potentially the purchase of this portrait lens. Please don't leave me any hate for that. Yeah, I'm providing these for the personal use of assessing the lens to see if you want to buy it. So please respect my copyright. Please don't distribute these files anywhere, online or otherwise. Don't misrepresent them as your own. Don't use them for your own reviews, etc., etc. They're here for pixel peeping and deciding if you want to plunk down on this very expensive lens. Saying that, we're going to be hard on this lens. That's one of the reasons I have extra samples today. The other reason is because I'm messed up. So let's get into that. Oh, let's look at this. So you see this? This is not Polaris signing its signature. This is what happens when you've got some excessive wind or vibration, and it really draws kind of like light trails all over the place. Here you can see it faintly. Every star is going to have this same thing happening. The dimmer stars will just look hazy. So I'm showing you that because, wouldn't you know it, I messed up. So see these? Something look a little bit off. Maybe like it's wearing a little party hat. Maybe like it has a little chin on the bottom. Yeah, that's wind shake, unfortunately. I took these, in my defense, in the middle of February in Canada when it was very cold. At midnight 30, very, very late. I was up till 4 a.m. this night actually testing a bunch of lenses. And unfortunately, I did not catch this or catch it here in this other sample as well, where you can see these stars have like almost like a little swoosh happening here and like a thing up and down. Really sorry about that. My goof. That being said, I do have some redemption here. This is Polaris, taken just here in August, and it is a 3-minute exposure. And here, as we see, while there's some other stuff we will discuss in a little bit, none of the stars have little hats or little chins. So I hope this assuages any concerns that those samples indicate the performance of the lens. Far from it. Here, if we come in here, same thing. This is a 2-minute exposure at f1.8. No little hats. Here's a third example, 2-minute exposure. No little hats, no little chins. So we'll get to those later. So apologies for that goof. I am embarrassed, but I'm going to use it anyway because it doesn't change a lot of the rest that we have to talk about, which includes vignetting. Here we can see we've got some pretty strong vignetting, and that's not unusual. It's not completely black in the corners, which is good, but it's not perfectly exposed across the frame, which, you know, nothing ever really is. And we'll see if the corrections can help us with that later. Another thing you might notice, it's very bright comparatively in the center and darker as we get out to the edges. So there's probably some loss of contrast here in the center. And if I flip to the F2 sample, just stopping down just the minutest amount gets rid of that hot spot in the center. And if you watch the histogram does not take a frame shift to the left. So the darks don't get darker. It just trims a little bit off the right side of the histogram, gets rid of that brightness. So I'll flip back to 1.8 and then back to F2. So what that means is we're just cleaning up the center exposure and the edges of the frame are pretty much left untouched by that. Is that to say that this isn't going to be some useful exposure? I don't know. It's going to be up to you. Maybe you'll get a few more photons wide open like this, but so far there's a reason to stop down to F2. And if we just go through here, 2.2 gets quite dark. real quick, you can see up here on the right, we're getting closer to the left side of the histogram. I'll just flip back. See how things are kind of shifting. And then f2.5, and then f2.8. We've lost a lot of exposure. I don't think this is a useful thing to do with this lens personally. One thing I do want to mention here is things are strongly blue. I let the camera decide its color balance, and I think it chose wrong. So I'm just going to take these samples and I'm going to change the white balance to auto, which normally you wouldn't really want to do, but you can see it's lined up the histogram here. It's made it look a lot more neutral. So now that we have a little bit more of a neutral color balance, it's popped in the center here. And again, it's embarrassing every time I see this, but we're just going to roll with it. Ignore the party hat and notice the chromatic aberration. This faint yellow-green fuzz, that is chromatic aberration from the lens failing to adequately focus that yellow-green color of light. What happens when something gets defocused? Well, that sort of bloats out, doesn't it? This is where you kind of have to draw a line between chromatic aberration and spherical aberration, because spherical aberration will result in bloated stars because the type of lens elements will not correct for that bloating. In this case, I don't really think that's what's happening. I'll put the optical formula on the screen. There is a spherical element in there, at least one. And yeah, overall, I don't see any other indications of spherical aberration. So I think this fuzzing out is just chromatic aberration. Next, let's look at one of the other samples here, because I think we're going to get a little bit better view. Let's pop into the corners. And here we go. We're going to talk about some of this business. We're going to talk about astigmatism. And I know some of you in your head might have thought for a second, coma. Dear viewer, I have news. This is not actually coma. I know it gets tossed around on the net a lot, but this is astigmatism. Chromatic aberration is an entirely different thing. But let's consider these brighter stars. You can see there's, like, in a lot of cases, a little purple spike going this way, and maybe some greeny spikes coming out to the side. This is one of many manifestations of astigmatism. Two kinds, actually. First, you have tangential astigmatism. Tangential astigmatism happens along radii from the center of the frame to the edges. So what will happen is, if there is tangential astigmatism, you'll get stretching of these stars along that radii. And here, like, there is a little bit of stretching. If we come into one of the other corners, yeah, a little bit of stretching here as well. So I'm pretty confident we've got a little bit of that tangential astigmatism, but thankfully, it is not really bad at all. There are some really extreme forms of it, and this is tame by any standard. Again, these little front bits, these are part of what you would consider sagittal astigmatism. Sagittal astigmatism happens at a right angle to tangential astigmatism. So you've got that radii from the center. Wherever it goes through a star, you'll get a stretching in that direction. And then in the right angle direction, you'll get a stretching as well. I'm aware that these are out in the front a little bit. I'm aware that they're curved a little bit, but you can see that they're at a different axis. And sometimes they'll curve out, sometimes they'll curve in, sometimes they'll be straight out. They have all kinds of different manifestations. In this case, luckily, the manifestation is very, very, very slight. That's barely noticeable. And more noticeable, I think, is actually the chromatic aberration that we're getting. Purple on this side and a little bit of teal on this side, or yellow. You can see on some of these stars, depending on the star's color, if it's a warmer star, you'll have a little bit of a warmer color there, but that is not really that bad, all things considered. If we zoom out, this is where I'm most concerned. How much bigger do the aberrations make the stars at different parts of the frame look compared to an ideal center? So here we have usually nice tight stars, and then out to the edges, do they get really big? Do they get really stretched out? In this case, not at all. Like, this is really, really encouraging, which I would expect given, again, the price of this lens. So what is coma? Well, coma is a bit different. And we're going to ignore this for a second. We're going to come back to it. But I'm going to use it as an example, actually. So imagine only half of this fuzziness was here. So pretend on this side, it was just normal star, and then we get this fuzzy tail almost that comes out the other end. That's chromatic aberration. It's named after the coma from comets. So that fuzzy tail resembles a comet. That's where it gets its name. You'll have two types. External coma will point away from the center of the frame. internal coma will point towards the center of the frame. And here, let's see. I don't think, now keep this in mind, I don't know the technical term for what's going on here. I feel like this is diffraction, which we'll get to in a little bit. I don't think this is coma, but it could be related in some way. But given normal everyday coma, if you look at some of these stars, you don't see any fuzzy fuzz. Some of the brighter ones, you've got a little bit of that chromatic aberration, that yellowy green. Maybe here it's fuzzing, but it's fuzzing kind of all around a little bit. So I don't really think we've got classic coma going on, which is good. What we do have doesn't really affect things very much, which is also good. And overall, yeah, if you want to learn more about coma, that link in the description that I talked about, there's another article at the end of that that will talk about all these different aberrations in detail from, I think it's Lonely Speck. Shout out to Lonely Speck. And you can see some examples of true chromatic aberration. Here, I'm not really sure that's what's going on. But you can see even here, we got Polaris almost near the dead center of the frame. It's got a little bit of dark wedginess happening. And then on these stars, very apparent. It's like kind of fuzzy, but dark wedges in the middle. And I think that might be diffraction. I'm going to have to find an optical engineer to talk to. Please don't take my self-certified lens reviewer's license away because of this. But yeah, here, I think we've got some diffraction happening. I've seen this in quite a few lenses, especially some of these Sony lenses at this point. And like I need to know the name. I'll pin it in the comment section if I ever figure out the exact details. In the meantime, I think this is some diffraction. And you can see that it does happen on many, many bright stars. Once they hit a certain threshold, it starts to occur here. So it is relevant. But luckily, even here, if we go full screen with this 27-inch monitor, I can't quite see these. So literally get out a tape measure here. All right. This is approximately 20 inches by 13 inches. So I'm viewing this from about 1.5 feet away. It's 20 inches by 13 inches. From your view, there's going to be a bit cut off the top, apologies. And I can tell you, I can't really see a difference in the star shapes here. If anything, I can kind of see a little bit of that dark wedginess on Polaris here because it's really bright, but these aren't really showing up visually, which is good. They exist though, which is bad, but I can live with it. Although, again, for the 1000th time, this is an expensive lens. Can you live with it? Well, that's up to you. We're going to go back now to our original sample set here. And we're going to look in the center and see what happens as we stop down. So this is F1.8. We stop down to F2. All right, so remember how we mentioned that the contrast does improve in the center when stopping down to F2? Well, it has a really strong effect here on removing that chromatic aberration, that little bit of blooming. And that is probably a lot of what's contributing to this extra boost in exposure. So I think we're really getting cleaner stars here. I don't see any reason not to stop this lens down to F2. But let's go through here. 2.2, well, quite a bit darker. 2.5 here, we get that little wind shake shape. F2.8, things are a little oblong here. That's either some deck drift or some more subtle shake, but this is so dark, I really don't think you should be shooting this lens at that point. So far, I think you should be shooting it at F2. That's just my human opinion. All right, let's look in a corner, and I think the bottom right has a lot of stars. And here we can see, again, we've got that little bit of triangular shape coming from the astigmatism and a little bit of that chromatic aberration. It's quite dark in the corner here, like right out to the very, very edge. That being said, they're still pretty good size. Shape's not too bad. Stopping down to F2, like 0 improvement. 2.2, no improvement. 2.5, it's even worse a little bit because it's got that shake, so ignore that. And F2.8, no real change, really. It's pretty much the same the whole way through. So based on that, I don't see any reason why you would avoid F2. It's the same as everything else. Too bad that little bit of chromatic aberration didn't clean up, but it's not something you can see normally anyway. But let's nitpick. I want to be a nitpicker. So now let's look over here at these stars. And here we see we've got that double lobe thing happening. So what happens if we stop down? Boom. Ooh. Hey, look. It's a butterfly. Okay. Sorry about that. So here we are at F2, and stopping down to F2 changes things a little bit. Still got a little bit of those dark bits, but they are thinner and more spread out, and there's more of them. We're not just two wedges. And you see we got little bright tines. Here, they're spreading out a little bit. And that is due to diffraction from the aperture blades, which really makes me wonder, again, if I'm on the right track here, that this is some type of diffraction. That being said, that little bit of blooming here isn't getting corrected, but I'm going to say that this is an improvement because it's giving a little bit more of a rounder shape overall. And I think this is going to be more useful as far as stacking goes, or just viewing from a normal distance. If we stop down again to 2.2, here we're starting to see a classic sunstar shape here. We've got the tines from the aperture blades. Luckily, they don't form like really defined spikes. They're a little bit hazy, which isn't usually good for sunstars, but it is good for astrophotography because that diffraction is less distracting. You can stack this better, especially if your alignment changes. 2.5, even thinner, although you do have to keep in mind that there was some shake here that might be affecting things a little bit. And 2.8, much thinner, but also much fuzzier. And just overall, I don't think that it's getting enough exposure here. So if I had to choose, again, it'd be the F2. I think F2 is the winner here. And not just because this reminds me of a fairy from Legend of Zelda. Yeah, I enjoy a bit of Zelda, or at least I used to, back when I had free time. So far, I think F2 is the ticket with this lens. So now we're going to take a little bit of a look at this one, just because it's, I think, a cleaner overall frame. And we're going to compare the size of the smaller mid-sized stars here, not these big bright ones, but just the more moderate brightness ones. And we can see they're all about the size of the cursor or smaller. Then if we pop over to the edge, we're going to compare again. And see, they're all about the same size. Mind you, of course, the shape has changed, but as far as size goes, they look about the same. Mid-frame, still very consistent. So why am I doing that? Well, I'm looking for field curvature. Field curvature is what happens when you have a curved lens and you're trying to take light and focus it onto a flat surface, like a sensor. You might find that if you're in focus in the center, it might go out of focus near the edges. It's very difficult to get everything perfect all the time. Vice versa is also true. The corners might be in focus, but the center might be out of focus. And in this case, that's not the case. The center stars in focus look about the same size, keeping the astigmatism in mind, but the same size as the ones in the center, really. So that's a good sign. That's nothing to worry about. Now we're going to assess the distortion and vignetting corrections for the lens. I'm going to go back to this original sample, pop over to the Develop module, and I'm really curious if this greeny yellow is cleaned up when we remove chromatic aberration. And it's not. That's not a surprise. It hardly ever happens. So we can come over here to the Manual tab, Dropper, and click. And, oh, that actually really did clean it up. So, yeah, that yellowy green fringe can be fixed in one click. We come up here to the edge, extreme edge, where we have like a little bit of purple and green, maybe. Let's see. Click. And that itself is corrected as well. That's the defringe tool for you. So both of those are totally usable, and I don't see any reason not to. That being said, the fringing wasn't really bad, so it doesn't probably make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things, but at least you know you can do it. Finally, let's enable the profile correction and see a couple things happening. So first, the vignetting is not being corrected completely. It's helping it some, but it's not doing the whole kit and caboodle. So that is going to take a little bit of manual work. We might have to come in here, adjust things a little bit, and you might get a cleaner result that way. I do see a little bit of hot spot here, so I'm not quite perfect, but you get the idea. You can improve things. Mind you, this is the F1.8 frame. You might have an easier time if we're shooting at F2, because you won't have to deal with that hot spot. The other thing that we've got here, we've got very slight pin cushion distortion, and the correction is accounting for that. So pin cushion distortion is when it's like the middle of the frame is getting pushed away from the viewer. The remedy for that is bringing the middle of the frame and kind of stretching it back out. That gives a sense that it's being pulled towards the viewer, flattened towards the viewer. But one thing you will notice is the corners don't really shift. and very minor shifting on the long and short edges. You can watch for stars that will disappear. You can see there's a couple of stars that are gonzo, but we're not really affecting this lens's field of view at all, which is great. This is really minor as far as distortion goes. If we scale down, we can see what's happening to correct it. It's transforming a little bit out here in the middle and even more subtly on the short edges. Really good result. Doing this will help with stacking. It'll give you sort of more consistent, flatter frame. But all said and done, quite happy with that. We're not losing any focal length and we're not losing much resolution either, because to do this, it does have to stretch out some pixels. Now that we've got that business covered, well, we can take one last look here and let's look at this frame. Here we've got the Omega and Eagle nebulae. Pop into the center here. Here you can see stars are reasonably round. Once you get down to the smaller, dimmer stars, that spatial filtering or star eater does play a little bit of havoc with the shapes. Sometimes like here, emerge two stars. They just kind of like unround them a little bit, but for the brighter ones, it's never really an issue. And while the A7R Mark V is a bit better, I'm not unhappy with this result because you see the picture like this, not in here at 400. That being said, 60 megapixels gives us pretty good detail actually on the Omega Nebula here. We are benefiting from that extra red. So if we come up here and reset, this is what we're getting out of camera. And this is after this is honestly a really quick white balance correction. Here we've got the Eagle Nebula and we've got pillars, not bad. The resolving power of this lens is pretty good. I will say after taking a look at these and knowing everything I know now, the one thing I do wish that I did was stop down to F2. Here we can see bright star very near the edge. So it's getting the double whammy of some tangential astigmatism and this lighthouse shape, this whatever it is, diffraction or whatnot. Much would have preferred the manifestation that it has at F2. So I'll remember for next year, I guess. Milky Way season's over up here. Here at the top of the frame, same kind of thing happening, but not too bad. Wouldn't really notice too much. And we have an interesting extra tine here. Don't know what that's from. And there you go. You know what? I'm not unhappy with this performance. I think it's done a pretty decent job, especially at F2. I think this is just an overall really usable lens as far as aberrations go. So that's the most important thing. And since I got it on hand, well, I'm going to get out and use it. But first, let's wrap this up. All right. That is the Sony G Master 135mm f1.8 lens. Medium telephoto, barely telephoto, kind of telephoto, quite fast. And as you would expect from a lens of this quality, actually not too bad. Yeah, this one I think is going to stay in the kit for a little while. And as I mentioned at the start of the video, if there is an updated version at some point, that would be worth a look as well. Hopefully this look at this lens has given you, dear viewer, the tools and information you need to assess if this is a lens that needs to be in your kit. And yeah, it is really nice. Obviously, it's great for portraits. You could use it actually quite successfully for telephoto landscape photography as well. So I think this is overall a really competent lens and one that I'm not too unhappy to be in possession of. That being said, hopefully we'll catch you next time for whatever else is coming down the pike. For those of you who might have watched a few of these more recent reviews, you'll notice I'm wearing the same green shirt. It's because I'm filming it all on the same day. Go figure. So, catch you in the next one. Take care.